Thank you for watching this clip. It contains some information and some tasks for you to do to prepare for the class on Wednesday. The teaching for this case goes over 2 weeks. There are 3 skill classes and 2 weeks of teaching on the Wednesday. So I'm going to present to you some information that will help you prepare for this Wednesday's teaching. That's Wednesday, October the 7th, 2015. Overall, we're covering semantics, pragmatics, conversational discourse and narrative language across the 2 weeks. In the first week, we're actually covering 3 of the 4 items: semantics, pragmatics and conversational discourse. We'll look at impairment and assessment and intervention for children and adolescents. And one of the distinctive features about this case is that it's taking you into school age and even beyond school age language needs for children at the upper end of primary school and adolescents. Okay, so on Wednesday, the lecture will be on both semantics and pragmatics and conversational discourse. I keep pragmatics and conversational discourse together because they're so intertwined, it's too artificial to separate them. So let's briefly look at semantics to start with. First of all, you're going to have to get used to a few really bad, corny jokes throughout the lecture and throughout these weeks of teaching, not because I like corny jokes, but because it really does give some insight into what I call higher order language and how we have to have a much more sophisticated understanding and use of language to be able to use figurative language, metaphoric language, and to have language skills for academic purposes. So I'll give you a moment to read this very corny slide, and we'll talk a little bit more on Wednesday about how we use language, and particularly semantic language, to get humour and to create humour. Back to the teaching trajectory. The circles in white are areas that we've covered, both in ACS and AIA, and the 4 coloured circles are areas we'll be covering over the next 2 weeks. So, preparatory content. In this clip, I'm going to define semantics and define pragmatics and conversational discourse. I'll talk briefly about development of semantics and development of pragmatics and conversational discourse. So all of these areas will be largely familiar and revision for you. I'll also present just a small amount of information on additional features to help you expand your conceptualisation of semantics, pragmatics and conversational discourse, and we will expand further on that in the lectures. So briefly looking at developmental sequence for semantics, you can see on the left-hand side I've got broad age ranges, 18 months, 3 years, then 4 years, and there's an exponential growth. At around 18 months, we expect about 50 words or 50 vocabulary items in the child's lexicon. And we also start seeing children using 2-word phrases. So they're starting to use semantic relations between words. So not just single words labeling things, but starting to use 2 words in a row so that we can start getting a sense of semantic relations. The very famous phrase that's used a lot in books to describe children's language development is the phrase mummy sock, which could mean many things, such as, that's mummy's sock, mummy put my sock on, mummy your sock is on the floor, and so forth. There are a whole lot of other things, variables to consider, such as context, child's intonation, and so forth. But that's pretty much what we're expecting at around 18 months. By 3 years, when MLU has further increased, we expect the child to have a vocabulary of about 1,000 words. And importantly, this occurs without formal instruction. So they're not parents, childcare workers teaching children words. This exponential growth in vocabulary occurs through normal interactions with others in the child's environment. By 4 years old, the vocabulary has expanded even further, quite exponentially, so that there should be a rich vocabulary to express a wide range of semantic associations and relations, and also to be able to reflect syntactic knowledge as well. So in sum, from 18 months to 18 years, children learn on average about 9 to 10 words a day. Now that's going to come in fits and starts, not progressive. But once again, adults typically do not teach children their vocabulary. We will look on Wednesday about mapping theory, which is a really strong theory about how children actually learn words and acquire vocabulary, and then a more sophisticated vocabulary as well. So on this slide, there is a list of items or semantic skills that are essential for success with academic learning, therefore important for school students. So in the first column, I've got some skills that I'd like you to see if you can provide examples for. Some of these you'll know from your general knowledge, some of them you might have to look up. So literate lexicon, the lexicon we use for more formal language. Category membership and exclusion, relationships between words, synonyms, antonyms, and homophones, which many of you may remember from school activities, and then being able to define attributes, expanding descriptions, and providing definitions, all important skills for academic needs. So this is something that we will go through in the lecture, but I'd like you to see if you can think of examples of what they might be. And here is your last task related to semantics. I'll be talking a lot about different properties of semantics and talk about how closely semantics is to the dynamic and evolving nature of language. Language is never static. It's always evolving and changing. So if you would go back in a time machine and be part of the 19th century, many of the words would be different. There would be many words that you would never have heard of, and certainly words that are not used then that are used now. So your task again before Wednesday is to see if you can think of any examples of each of these three types. So new words, new phrases, any acronyms that are in the English language. So perhaps 10 years ago, the word texting would have become a new word when texting on mobiles was novel. Now it's just very de rigueur. Words that have either shifted meaning or expanded meaning, and words that identify one by their social class, race, religion, age, and so forth. So again, an example of that is language that's often used in The Simpsons. So people in various generations would be very familiar with some of those words, and in other generations would be completely unfamiliar with some of those words. So again, that's just for you to have a bit of fun with, but to really start thinking about how semantics and vocabulary is never static. Okay, let's turn to pragmatics and conversation discourse, and you can see the little diagram here shows that it can be a one-to-one, a one-to-many activity. As a start, pragmatics as a definition involves the rules that govern language in a social context. So whilst we can have language knowledge and good language use from a perspective of phonology, semantics, syntax, and morphology, we need to be able to apply that in a social context, and this is pragmatics. Helps us to use our language in a social or conversational context. Pragmatics is broad-reaching and ranges from being able to use politeness markers and greetings to things like taking turns in conversation, repairing conversations that have broken down, even if it's perhaps you've said the wrong word and you'll automatically repair. We know from infancy that a very active participation in parent-child or adult-child interactions promotes children's language learning without formal instruction, but just being part of that interaction. So again, another task for you to think about: what pragmatic behaviours have you engaged in the last 4 hours? What behaviours were they? See if you can document them. What tone or register did you need to use? Now, by tone or register, I'm talking here about what sort of rules did you put on the types of interactions you had based on who it was that you were talking to. If you, for example, were at work, you might have had to use a particular tone for a customer or a more senior person than you. If your interactions were with very close friends, you might have used maybe swear words or words that you might not use in more formal situations. I'd then like you to think about what you did to make the interaction work. What conversational behaviours and pragmatic skills did you apply to make it work? And did anything go wrong? Try and document them as well. Like other behaviours around language, pragmatics and conversational discourse has a set of milestones as well. Development commences from infancy and develops rapidly before the onset of the first word. So effectively, infants are using many pragmatic behaviours, such as attending to a social partner, well before even babbling occurs. Other behaviours that are occurring in the first year are things like being aware of strangers and looking at faces, so being able to recognise familiar faces and responding to familiarity versus an unfamiliar face, sometimes with crying. You may have heard the phrase stranger danger. This is part of stranger danger. At about 4 months, children recognise their name and will turn when they're called, and they will do lots of face gazing, which is very important for setting up joint attention. Now, joint attention is when people are duly engaged in an activity, and this joint attention is the underpinning basis for conversational discourse, which itself is a joint activity. We then see the onset of intentional communication from about 8 months old. So these are communication acts that have a particular intent that the user has decided to use, maybe not consciously for an infant, but behaviours pre 1 year old are things like protesting, wanting, gesturing. For example, while talking to babies, after each comment or question, much more time in between, as if compared to someone with